And now joining us on Book TV in London is author Richard Seymour. Mr. Seymour, before we start talking about some of your books, introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us about yourself.
Okay, well, I'm a PhD student at the London School of Economics, so that's what I spend most of my time doing. I do some writing on the side. I write for the Guardian newspaper, and I've written a few books, and I blog as well.
And what's your blog called?
Lenin's Tomb.
Why do you call it that, and what do you blog about?
It's a repository of undead ideas in a way. It's what's worth rescuing from 20th century communism, if you like. That's what I spend a lot of time talking about. And it's just generally a forum for left-wing politics.
Are you a communist?
I would describe myself as a socialist because I don't want to be associated with the experience of Stalinism, the experience of all the dictatorships that were erected in the name of communism. So I wouldn't call myself a communist.
What about a Marxist?
Yeah, I'm very much a Marxist.
Why?
I suppose for the same reasons that one of our subjects, Christopher Hitchens, was during his time. I consider it a superior way of explaining societies and the way that they work, and explaining politics.
Did, in your view, the Soviet Union subvert Marxism?
I wouldn't say that it subverted Marxism. What I would say is that a hopeful experiment in a radical new type of socialist democracy was crushed very quickly due to starvation, civil war, and all sorts of things. It became an authoritarian dictatorship, and what had been a sort of a free-flowing set of radical ideas called Marxism became a state religion, and it became a dogma. And that has been replicated not just in regimes around the world, but in various parties around the world.
What is the Socialist Workers' Party?
Socialist Workers' Party is the party to which I used to belong until Monday. It is a Trotskyist or post-Trotskyist organization. It's quite heterodox in some ways, but essentially it was defined by its critical attitude towards the USSR and the Stalinist regimes. And yet maintaining a revolutionary socialist politics. Again, one of our subjects, Christopher Hitchens, was a member of its forerunner, the International Socialists, before it became the Socialist Workers' Party. So I stood very much in the same sort of political tradition as him, which is one of the reasons I decided to write about him.
Well, you've mentioned Christopher Hitchens a couple of times, Mr. Seymour, and your most recent book is called Unhitched, The Short Trial of Christopher Hitchens. Of what do you accuse him?
I think there's a few things. First of all, I think that in the last 10 years of his life, when he achieved the greatest accolades, the greatest celebrity, and probably the most money, he was the least convincing as an intellectual, as a polemicist, as somebody who was known as a political writer. For example, I think that in his writing on religion, he took an essentialist point of view, which is to say that religions are fairly monolithic. You can reduce them to a concrete, coherent set of ideas, and they're not susceptible to interpretation in the way that people implement them. So, as it happens, many of his interpretations of religion were based on just straightforward error or misrepresentation. Certainly that's what I found looking through theological scholarship when reviewing his writing on it. But I think the problem with it was that that was secondary to a wider political agenda, because Christopher Hitchens had backed the war in Iraq. He had said that he was in favor of that war because it would free the people of Iraq from a terrible, oppressive regime. So far, so good. The problem is that after the war is ended, non-stop chaos, non-stop bloodshed, and he has to explain this. And essentially he says it's because of the religious, it's because of the Islamo-fascists, it's because of the religious groups that have been tearing the country apart since the occupation began, and it's not because of the occupation itself and the way it introduced a degree of sectarian politics into the Iraqi state. And he generalized out from that to explain Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, where I come from, Northern Ireland. He explained that conflicts with reference to religion. And the irony is that, I mean, I come from Northern Ireland. I had never heard anyone refer to the IRA or the UVF, the sort of gangs there, as religious death squads until he did, because we never understood it in those terms. And it felt to me, as somebody who came from there, that this was the position of somebody from the metropole saying, you know, these backward sort of little colonial places with their funny backward ideas are killing each other because of their funny backward ideas. It's actually always a lot more complicated than that. And it's ironic that it took Tony Blair in debate with Hitchens to point this out. I find myself on Tony Blair's side perhaps for the first time.
So when it comes to Christopher Hitchens, the last 10 years, were you an admirer of his prior to that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And even a lot of what he wrote afterwards, I thought it was well worth reading. The problem I guess I have is that he ceased to be as unpredictable as he had been. I mean, I almost knew what he was going to say every week, especially if it was about war or if it was about religion. I knew almost exactly what he was going to say. If he chose the subject of the Kurds, he was going to say that the Kurds were an example of what Iraq could have been, how the liberation of Iraq could have went if it weren't for the religious. If he was going to talk about religion, he was going to talk about the baleful effects that it had on democracy and so on and so forth. So he lost a bit of his edge, I think, and a bit of his originality, which I always thought existed in the fact that he was somebody who was quite unique in American politics, not just the bad boy Brit who, you know, wound up the American establishment, but somebody who unapologetically argued for socialist politics in a country where hardly anyone does that.
So, Richard Seymour, was there a different solution or non-solution to Iraq?
Yeah, I think they should have been allowed to have their Tahrir moment. The moment of Tahrir Square in Egypt, where millions of people were united in an ecstatic moment and faced down a fairly well-entrenched dictatorship. And this wasn't a dictatorship that was weakened and isolated by years of sanctions and so on. This was a regime that was internationally respected. Tony Blair went on television and said, you know, this guy is a pretty good guy. Joe Biden...
Mubarak, President Mubarak.
Yeah.
Right.
Joe Biden said the same thing. So he had international backing, he had respect, and he had a degree of authority. Nonetheless, he was overthrown. I'm convinced that had the United States, rather than sort of invading in the way that it did, destroying the existing state apparatuses and, you know, creating chaos and unemployment, had they left the country alone and left the people alone to rebuild, you know, I think they would have found a way to oust Saddam. And I think that was, you know, we've seen that in Tunisia. We've seen nascent attempts in Yemen, in Algeria and elsewhere, probably Bahrain. So I think that the Arab Spring shows the way forward.
So, Richard Seymour, currently the situation in Syria, where, if anything, would you like to see the international community get involved?
Well, I think, first of all, the international community is one of those concepts I always like to unpack. Who is it? What does it consist of? You know, countries are not united in and of themselves, never mind with one another. I think there are great divisions internationally about what to do about Syria. Pardon me. Personally, I think one of the great problems with Syria is the degree of intervention that's already taking place. There are countries that are intervening, supplying really radical Wahhabi sort of squads with arms in a way that's not helping the revolutionary process. It's helping the most right-wing reactionary forces there. So I think they should keep well out of it. On the other hand, I think that if the revolutionaries on the ground in Syria wish to purchase weapons, if they wish to forge agreements with other people outside of the country, they are perfectly entitled to do that. I just think that nothing should be done that comes from above, as if to say, you know, we sort of Superman are going to come in and save the day, because that almost never works.
Do you think that Iraq, Baghdad, could have had a Tahrir Square moment? Do you think Saddam Hussein and Hosni Mubarak are the same person in essence?
No. I think the Hussein regime was actually in many ways a lot worse, but not just a lot worse. I think that by the time of 2002, 2003, it was a lot weaker in many respects. Partly this has got to do with how well these regimes are able to maintain a broad social basis.